Hello and welcome to this lecture series on race and slavery. Today we're going to start with part 1, racism. So as we start out on this, we need to start by defining what racism actually is, because we have a tendency to vary that definition based on our either personal or political needs. Right? By definition, racism is an attitude, action, or institutional structure which subordinates a person or a group of people because of their color. And the key word is just that, color. It's skin pigment, right? Now, like I said, sometimes we'll broaden that out. You'll see people refer to things like the African race, right, or the Jewish race, right? Now you're starting to throw ethnicity or religion into the racial category. So there's a lot of blurring of the lines, right? But in general, the definition of racism is based on color. Now, an example of an institutional structure would be slavery, right? Specifically, American slavery, because American slavery became based solely on skin color. From the earliest British settlements, overt racism was a central part of American colonial life and continued to force those who were non-white into a state of subordination, right? And it traces all the way back to the original 20 Africans who were dropped off at Jamestown. And it'll continue as we move forward. And again, the primary focal point here is not so much them being African, but them being colored. So as we move forward here, there's two caveats we have to make. First of all, Americans who were not exposed to slavery on a daily basis typically didn't think about it, right? If you didn't see slavery around you, you didn't pay it any attention. So like, say, example, in the North where slavery died out, a Northerner in general typically would not readily think about slavery. This really makes sense when you think about it. I mean, how many of you are thinking about right now the refugee crisis of Syrians in southern Turkey, right? You're not exposed to that. But I bet you if you lived in that region and saw the refugee camps and was exposed to that on a daily basis, you would think about it a lot more. The second caveat, and more importantly, is that there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that any racial group is superior or inferior to any other. Human beings are a single biological species. We do not have any subspecies like what you see amongst, like, say, for example, the apes or dogs or even cats. I'll try and give you a very relatable example there. There are no subspecies of humans. Biologically, we are all just one species. We originated from Central and Eastern Africa, and we expanded out from there, right? We went into Europe and Asia, and eventually across every continent. I mean, heck, we have humans today in Antarctica, right? We spread like, well, I guess I'm going to say ants, right? Because any other example I might give might seem a little bit degrading, right? But we spread across the entire planet. And though we have some visual variations, right, some visual appearance variations, biologically, we are one species. Here are a couple quotes to really drive that point home. Alan Goodman is a biological anthropologist, and what he said about race is that race is not based on biology, but race is rather an idea we ascribe to biology. In other words, it's kind of backwards thinking. Race isn't a product of biology. Race is a social construct, right? We create it in our societies. Evolutionary biologist Joseph Graves said the measure amount of genetic variation in the human population is extremely small, and that's something that people need to wrap themselves around, that genetically we really aren't very different, and we are actually incredibly similar. As I said, we are biologically one species, but we are also biologically one of the genetically most similar species on the entire planet. 1 out of every 1,000 nucleotides of human DNA has some form of genetic variation. By comparison, penguins, it's 1 out of every 500, right? So they are twice as dissimilar. Twice as dissimilar. Now, I know you look at a penguin, you go, really? You look at two penguins of the same subspecies, right? Like, say, emperor penguins, and you can't tell them apart. But the reality is that they're genetically twice as dissimilar as us, right? As I mentioned before, race is not a biological idea. It is a social idea. There are no subspecies of humans. As a matter of fact, as a mental practice, if there was a catastrophe across the entire globe that wiped out everyone except the people in Europe, all right, only Europeans survived and the rest of the globe got wiped out, we would still maintain 94% of our genetic similarities, right? That's how we would only have about 6% variation, right? Meanwhile, you take two fruit flies in the same room, we are actually more genetically similar to chimpanzees than two fruit flies are to each other, right? Now, there's a lot of things driving this. Like I said, you have genetic variation. This is typically caused by genetic drift, right? Genetic drift takes generations. Well, take a look at a fruit fly. Average fruit fly's life is, what, 24 hours once it becomes a mature fly, which means it's only pretty much got one goal in life once that happens. I'll let you decide what that is. So that means if you take a look at a human generation, let's say 20 years for a human generation, 20, 25 years, how many generations of fruit flies have taken place in that time period, and how many opportunities has there been for genetic drift? So we just really need to understand that genetically we are a very similar species despite the visual appearance.